decided to be with us here today for this important discussion. As Øystein said, indeed, education is an important agent of socialization for the young generation, and it is also crucial for transmitting collective social values and norms. And we know that democracies understand this potency of education. In our work, we rely on working with education as a way to understand what values of democracy and human rights mean in practice and what competences we need to live together in our diverse democratic societies in a peaceful way. As Øystein said, we are aware that other regimes, autocratic regimes, also recognize the importance of the education as instrument. But there, perhaps, the idea of peaceful coexistence, the idea of a democratic development, is not the key purpose. When we started to think about what is happening in the world today, we had several events looking at the education as a way to support also what is happening in Ukraine. We have a big Ukrainian program where education is seen also as an instrument to support educators. But we also wanted to look at what happens if education becomes a tool for other practices. And over the past several months, we've been compiling some information about the different laws and policies as well as practices that are used in the Russian Federation. And we are still working on this report. So I will present to you some tendencies that we see. And the main aim today is to set a framework for the further discussion, because this is what we want to do. We want to show how many policies are in place, the machinery that the state employs in the education sector, and what educators and young people in the Russian Federation are faced with. I think this is an important thing to understand for us, and also in terms of if we move forward, what kind of system will we be dealing with in the future. If we talk about the Russian Federation and in general any education system, of course we cannot dissect the education system. It's not existing as in isolation. It is affected by the political developments. And I think many of you who follow the situation in the Russian Federation, we have many representatives here of the education sector of the Russian Federation who very well know these developments, not only in theory, but also in practice. And these are interlinked. And we can say that there was a search after the collapse of the Soviet Union for this new national idea, which is now based on the idea of the traditional values and the image of Russia as a great power. And it is also a way to help kind of see this as a way to say us versus them. So there's traditional values as opposing to European and Western values. There's also the increasing portrayal of the West as hostile. There's diminishing civic spaces. We observe this now, of course, very obviously, but don't forget this has been happening for a while. If you remember the protest in early 2000s, if you remember the protest in 2019 when young students were also detained, this is not something that it's something that's been there. It has been just escalating. And of course, militarization of society and aggressive foreign policy. Today we mark the 9th month of the escalated aggression of the Russian Federation on Ukraine. We also see the increased influence of the church in state affairs and in the school sector as well. And this is seen as a partner of the state who can help perhaps strengthen this idea of the traditional values. I wanted to show some numbers. Many of you know this again, but for those who don't, this is the numbers of the people engaged in the education sector. And it's not a full list because here we missed vocational training. But if we consider who is affected by the education sector, that we have 17 million school students. These are numbers from 2020. We have 1.7 million educators who are now in the education sector. If we look at the main developments, and here, when we started to compile this, our first instinct was to look at the practice, what is happening in schools, but then we realized, and universities, but then we realized we cannot do that because we also want to look at the policies that are in place, and we have revised several documents that I want to share with you. This is not an exhaustive list, and I sincerely hope that our further discussions here today will help us enrich our findings and perhaps also make some changes. But there are also some tendencies that we can see, and there's a number of legislation that is employed here. First of all, education is seen as a means to counteract expansion of foreign values, and this is stated both in the National Security Strategy and the Ministry of Education. which actually plans to prepare and implement measures to protect national interests of the Russian Federation in the field of science and higher education. This is the plan for the coming years. There's also a greater focus on patriotism and loyalty to the state when we talk about citizenship education. This is reflected both in the standard curricula and also in the national programs for upbringing. These are supported by additional extracurricular activities and practices that we see in schools and a certain culture that exists. And when we talk about each of them, we also have to understand that they are interlinked. We also see a greater control over curricula, content, education practice, and narratives. We see this very apparently now. But also before this, we see that, for example, there have been the idea of review of textbooks that was initiated by President Putin in 2013. There were several commissions looking at the falsification of history, and there is, of course, a number of restrictive legislation. If we take now the laws on fake news or discreditation of the Russian army, this is a clear indication what you can talk about and what you cannot talk about, and the kind of words you can use. Educators who use the words war, who talk about what is happening right now in terms of the war, they are persecuted. This is very indicative of the kind of things that are happening now. We also see that in terms of education practice, there is control in terms of reporting, especially now. You have to perform certain acts of patriotism at the schools, you have to send pictures, everybody have to be involved, you have to account for this. We also know that there is another side of this. So besides having some practical content and narrative control, there's also larger issues at play. Last year, a law was passed on educational activities that actually was connected to non-formal education activities, which said that the state wants to know what you are doing as a school, as an institution with other actors. You have to have the formal agreements in place, and you have to let us know. The foreign agent law is a direct restriction of civil society participation in the school sector. And for us, as an education that promotes participation of different actors for better quality of education, this is a very sad sign. The law has been around for a long time, but it has been expanded greatly. And now not only organizations, but also individuals can be proclaimed foreign agents. Besides this, to be proclaimed a foreign agent, it is actually enough to be influenced by a foreign organization or another foreign agent. The term influence is extremely broad and is hard to define. Therefore, it's also a very strong controlling measure. We also observe diminishing autonomy of higher education institutions. This is connected to the fact that, according, for example, to the fantastic student magazine Doxa, 47% of rectors in universities are connected to the ruling party, but also because there is a persecution again of those who are thinking in a different way, and we will hear today from our panelists the experience of this firsthand. We can talk about the example of the Higher School of Economics, where people were fired and were forced out in a way, but this is happening also in other places. There is also the increased oversight of university activities, especially when it comes to participation in different international projects and communities. And of course, now we also see that there is an isolation when it comes to the higher education system, and because of the situation, but Russia has also left the Bologna system, and this is something that will stay with us for some time, which makes cooperation on this level quite complex. We see isolation on one hand, and I would say that isolation is observed both in country, in terms of, for example, we isolate the education sector from the civil society sector, but also we see the isolation from the West. At the same time, there's also indication of expansion. We know now of plans that several universities are looking into the possibilities of expanding their services and expanding and the ideas perhaps also connected to traditional values and culture to other countries, focusing perhaps more on China and Central Asia, but also the humanitarian policy abroad that was signed into action by the President Putin in September indicates that there might be also ideas of moving forward to other countries and looking at education and culture as a way to also affect and bring in different narratives. If we look at the concrete examples of what is happening at the level of the schools, again, for many of you, you might have learned this before. I think it is very important that media also increasingly writes about these situations. We had, for example, also had the opportunity to read an observation from the Barents Observer yesterday. I think we need to keep this in mind and we need to keep our eyes on this. So some of the things that have been happening, we have, of course, learned about the weekly lessons dedicated to conversations about important issues. We have heard about the fact that military personnel is leading these lessons sometimes. We have heard about the fact that there are rituals that are now in place in schools, if I'm not mistaken, every Monday with raising the flag, listening to the anthem. We also know that there's a proposition for a basic military training course. In school curriculum, it is now under discussion, and the planned duration is quite large. The Fit for Labor and Defense topic or course has been extended with additional standards, including, for example, drone control. There's also a new course, Fundamental of Russian Statehood, that is being developed and might be also employed in higher education institutions, including the certification of teachers to teach this course. Existing practices such as cadet classes or Cossack organizations also create a space for militarization and kind of presenting a certain way of what citizenship is. There are also military training centers at some universities, and currently there are 90 plus such centers across the country. Non-formal education is also important, a way of bringing youth not only in schools to these values and ideas, but also outside. So we have some of these listed here. Perhaps most interesting or largest growth can be seen in UNARMIA, that has expanded from 700,000 to 1.2 million in autumn of 2021. So there's a big growth, and there's also recruitment through the schools to these movements. Now, as I say this, I feel a dissonance because what is not presented in the report is the fact that there is also the other side. There are parents and schools that don't participate in some of the activities, that resist and find ways, even in the existing legislation, to stop or not take active part in this. And I think this is important. I read recently that, for example, when schools ask students to join certain movements, they cannot do this. And there's the fantastic Teacher Alliance, there are fantastic NGOs that inform that you have rights as parents, you have rights as educators to say no, and this is fine. We also had the same situation about participation in these lessons about important issues. There are different ways that these are handled. Some talk about important issues that are important for the class. Some take absolutely a different topic than what is prescribed by the methodological materials. And yeah, importantly, parents also actively engage and try to understand what are their rights. Can I say no and not have my children participating in this? So there's a lot of movements here as well. Our aim with this report was really to show the machinery that people are facing. So what the state employs, but we have to also recognize that there is also let's say, pushback. Now in history education, and this is the last thing that I will touch today, which is also very important because it can be a way of portraying a very different narrative and as a way of indoctrination of the young people. What we observe now is that there will be an increasing number of academic hours for history education, and this is observed both in university level and at school level. So basically, even in grade 1, there will be also a history lessons now, increase in history hours at universities. And if we look at the thematic focus, then some of them are very clear and to the point, but also some of them are connected to the more recent development, annexation of Crimea, and there might be also ideas that the annexation of additional lands might also be here included. And there's the idea that the special military operation might be introduced also in the national history tests after the curriculum is prepared. But this is in development. And I'm happy also that here we have historians and education professionals from the field, from the Russian Federation. So don't run away during lunch. There is an opportunity here to also consult further. This is all I wanted to share with you today. As I mentioned, we have a much larger compilation of material that we will probably update after the seminar today, and that we aim to publish by the end of the year. But this is just the framework that we wanted to show for today, and hopefully we can build on in the further discussions. So, thank you. And now I will take the opportunity to present our moderators and the panelists that will be here today. So I will start with Denis Grekov, who is a lecturer from the Russian Federation, philosopher and political scientist, and and who is now unfortunately living abroad due to his active stance and outspoken and calling things what they are. So thank you very much, Denise, for being with us. We have also Yuri Lapshin, who is a teacher from a Moscow school, has been working there for a long time, but also now living abroad again. And school psychologist, thank you, and also now living abroad again for the same reasons. And also representing Norwegian institutions, we have here Anders Sjøstvedt from Oslo Met, who is a historian and also working at the Faculty of Pedagogy. And our wonderful moderators, I'm very happy to present my fantastic colleagues, Larissa Legander-Bronder, who has been supporting this event from the very beginning and who we worked very hard with, and our fantastic colleagues from the partner institution, Ina Berezkina, who is representing the School of Civic Education and who we had the pleasure to work with for many years. Please, I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you, and we have a bit of changes in our panel, because our one person, Britt-Maria Hofstad, didn't manage to join us because she's got sick. But we'll manage to handle the situation. Valentina has mentioned the latest development in the Russian Education Centre, which happened over the decades. And the changes we see in the school curricula reflect up to a certain extent the changes in the political and social life in the society. But the development of students happened not only directly within their official educational framework, but it's also happened through their social interaction with their peers and adults, and also through the school culture. And I have my first question to Yuri Lapshin. Yuri, you have a long-standing experience working as a psychologist at one of the biggest schools in Moscow, number 57. And in April 2022, you had to leave your position as the head of the psychological support department.
Yep.
And can you tell us, do you see the changes and transitions which happened in the school culture and in the school environment?
Well, thank you, of course. And I will speak Russian just to be more clear and, expressive. So if you don't understand Russian, please. Where are you? Thank you.
Good morning, dear colleagues. Yes, I worked at school for the last 10 years, and what I could notice before the war, the main ideology was the school is apolitical. The school is outside of politics. And the main idea of the administration, of the authorities, is to prevent school students from participating in protests and prevent teachers from expressing their position openly. And if I, as a psychologist, as a person working at school, wanted to participate in protests, everyone knew that I did, but I was told, and we were all told, not to talk about politics at school. And of course, teachers are not happy with the situation when they are unable to talk about the current events. And nowadays, children, pupils may ask any teacher of any subject about the current events. And for example, if a student approaches me and asks my opinion about the war, of course, I can't remain silent. This ideology became insufficient very quickly, but until the beginning of the academic year, the main requirements for teachers was not to include politics in the discussions. 2 days after the war started, and my school was one of the biggest and one of the oldest schools in Moscow, we celebrated the anniversary of our school, and a huge number of alumni, parents, and everyone gathered after the pandemics. And as I was the head of the school psychology support center and psychologist, I was approached by the head principal who told me, Yuri Gennadievich, please do whatever you want to avoid political statements. It was 2 days after the war started. I said, what can I do? We are dealing with teenagers, with young people. We have been already approached by the department and also by the extremism combating center, the so-called Center E. Of course, teachers did tell about their position also during the lessons.
Question you told about the teachers who tried to raise their voices, yeah?
Yes.
You mentioned the transition. You mentioned that the transition has happened from the policy of keeping politics out of the classroom to the current situation, when school has become a hub for mobilization and are reflecting kind of a mainstream politics in Russia, and also following the agenda set up by the Kremlin.
Yes, I will take,
and teachers and educators, they are instructed with false and misleading scripts how to talk about Ukraine and about the ongoing situation. And but there are also some educators who raise their voices and who try to continue teaching their students in non-partisan manner. Can you tell us about the situation with educators who dare to speak out?
Да, ну вот, значит, очень быстро, действительно, я извиняюсь.
Yes, very quickly. I'm sorry for speaking for such a long time. In March, the first teacher in Moscow was fired. I think his name was Kimran Manaflu. He was fired because he expressed his position publicly. People got afraid. And, it was included in the report that official events were launched in summer and teachers were unable to skip these events. You cannot skip these talks, conversations about important things, or raising the flag. So what did teachers start doing? Depending on the relations with the school and the parents, and depending on the pressure from the authorities, because it differs in various regions, teachers started to use Aesopian language, so to say. For example, in some schools, on only the class on duty had to attend this ceremony of raising a flag. So this procedure was formalized. Or as to the lessons, for example, if this conversation about important things, the topic is the Father's Day, and the biology teacher tells about philopatria phenomenon in biology, when many species, such as salmon, return to the place where they were born to procreate. So that was a profanization of the topic. Or if there was a nuclear topic, then the use of nuclear energy in biology and physics. So there were attempts to sabotage these topics. And that's the current resistance. And probably it will continue developing in the same way. And when I talk to my colleagues online, they say, we try to show our true attitude, not directly. And the strategy of the authorities seems to be as follows. People need to get used to the necessity to participate in these formal procedures, attend these lessons, attend the raising of a flag, and there will be more when people get used to it.
Article 29 of the Convention on the Right of the Child, it stated that children have the right to their quality education without being indoctrinated. And students in Russia, school children in Russia, are forced to participate in the state-run pro-war flash mobs, and they have to attend patriotic lectures, which pushed by the Kremlin. And the patriotic themes began to be one of the key narratives in history curricula and in school culture. And at this point, I will give the floor to Inna to continue to talk about the patriotism.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Yuri. I'll very quickly comment on that turn from school being out of politics to mobilization hub. As Kravtsov, the Ministry of Education, pointed out, that was done in response to children be exposed to propaganda and disinformation on the internet, and that's exactly how they put darkness for light and light for darkness, and they manipulate whatever is in their hands. We'll come back to that. We'll turn now to Anders. You're with the Faculty of Education and International Relations, but you also worked on the book, the study and the anthology of right-wing population in Western Europe. And if we are to talk about populism, right? Nationalism, populism, and patriotism, it's a very slippery slope if state is involved, because each one of these are easily becoming an instrument of control, and it opens rich opportunities for manipulation. How would you comment on that? And then we'll come back to the schools.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good and also very huge question. Of course, oops, I have so many devices here now, so I'm losing them. That's the penalty for not speaking Russian. If we start with patriotism, I think it's a very difficult term to use because it could mean so many different things. To be patriotic is not in itself dangerous. Many countries have started a school day by singing the national anthem or making a pledge of allegiance like they do in American schools. And parts of what are being taught in Russian schools now could be seen as very unproblematic, to defend against a foreign aggressor, to defend your values, and to be part of a nation. So the question we have to ask is that really true? Is Russia threatened by a foreign power? Is there a need to strengthen national values because they are threatened from the West? So the use. Oh, I'm not an expert on the Russian situation, but the use of the term patriotism in Russia today is very dangerous, because it's very militaristic. It's very pro-war, preparing youth and kids for military service, physically, as we just saw in the presentation, and also mentally and ideologically. But it's also dangerous because it's exclusive. It's a very strong and very exclusive understanding of what it means to be a Russian. So that is the main difficulties by using the term patriotism in Russia today.
One quick question, because if we are on this road, we easily end up at the narrative us versus them and us versus enemies and the others. And this is, again, I mean, in the situation that Russia finds itself, this is a dangerous thing. And this is what they're doing, manipulation, as I said. But before we go probably into history, I'd like to leave one question with you and maybe with the audience. This is not a bad thing, as you said, patriotism per se, or nationalism. It can be a healthy thing. But what if we look beyond bad or good nationalism and we look at the global thing? Because you cannot, I mean, if you see the interconnectedness of all the things and the world we are living in, you cannot afford being just nationalist. You cannot be just, your identity cannot be just national. It should be at least both national and global. But are we ready, even in healthy societies, are we ready for this, for embracing these global civics? It's over to you now, Larissa, because we have another question to Anders. But maybe we can come back to this question after we discuss this.
Okay, thank you. And we see that the patriotic narratives are funneled into the history curricula, and history is an important subject in every school system. History education molds the outlook of a young generation, and it serves to form their national identity and to shape them like loyal citizens. And with the rise of the national state in the end of the 18th century, history education has served as a tool to convey national narratives to students. And my question to Anders, can you tell us how these national narratives have been served into their history curricula in Norway in order to shape loyal citizens?
Yes, that's a very good question. And we could say that the history teaching started formally for all school children in Norway in the late 19th century. And for all history teaching in the Norwegian school system, the main question that has been asked, what is a Norwegian citizen? What does it mean to be Norwegian? What do you need to know to become part of the Norwegian nation? And the answer to that question has changed quite dramatically in the past 150 years. But if we go back to the beginning, late 19th century, this was very much what distinguished, or what was meant that distinguished Norwegian from other Scandinavian countries, and particularly Sweden and Denmark, because Norway was economically and politically very much influenced by our bigger neighbors. So what was very important in the late 19th century was what we could call particularist values that are specific to Norway. What makes Norway's special and exempt from Sweden and Denmark, and from Swedish language and Danish language. So there's no coincidence that fjords and mountains are considered to be particularly Norwegian, because it's a difference from Denmark. There are no mountains in Denmark. But this changes gradually in the early 20th century. The huge change is after the Second World War, when the image of the Norwegian citizen changes from more particular values to more universalist values, where it's a focus on not what you are and what you look like, but what you do. So there is a gradual introduction of more democratic or universal values. That changes over time. That's not something that happens overnight. So in history education, this is exemplified with that you not only learn about Norwegian history, but you're also supposed to have a critical view of Norwegian history. Are there parts of Norwegian history that needs to be rewritten? Are there parts of Norwegian history that we do not talk about? So that's particularly from the 1970s onwards, that is much more common and also written into the national curricula. So you could say that from the earliest days, late 19th century, there is a very focus on this is Norwegian and this makes us distinct from everybody else. Gradually from the interwar period and a change into more universalist values. But this takes time. This takes many decennia before we actually get there. And there is still a process, ongoing process. How do we teach history in order to prepare our students to be a part of Norwegian society? But the general direction is moving towards universalist values and to be critical of our own history.
Thank you, Anders. It's very important to develop critical thinking. And the idea of great power and the exclusive of their path of development and traditional values are the key national narratives which are funneled to the history curricula in Russia now. And I would like you maybe to provide examples or give a comment how similar national narratives before the First World War serve to construct the image of enemy. Can you elaborate a bit on this?
In the Norwegian school context? Yeah. What we have to remember is also that Norway is a very fortunate position in its history because most nationalist movements in the 19th century were also concerned with liberation, because most organizations that tried to liberate Norway politically, economically, culturally from Denmark and Sweden were also rather democratic. This is a difference from Denmark and Sweden, where nationalist movements are much more conservative, and particularly in Sweden, where nationalist movements used to be connected to the old history of Sweden being a great power. But in Norwegian history, nationalist movements have, especially in the 19th century, been connected to language and the liberation of Norway from other countries. So the creation of the other is someone that doesn't speak the Norwegian language. It's someone that does not share what is regarded as the traditional Norwegian values. So in the Norwegian case, that's usually connected to, at least in a historical sense, on national minorities like the Jewish population. Or the Sami population that speaks a different language, that traditionally have a different way of life from Norwegian majority society. So there is a strong element of us and them as well in the Norwegian context, but it's different from the Russian context because it doesn't have this strong focus on empire and great power, and we need to rule over these people. But it's very much connected to language and the way of life.
Thank you, Anders. And the West, with its liberal values, are viewed as a hostile in Russia, and this narrative is also how they translated to the history curricula at Russian schools. And are there any positive examples, successful examples how teaching history can deconstruct the image of enemies?
Well, I think that's a fairly recent development in the Norwegian school system from maybe the 1970s, when national curricula were rewritten and there was a renewed emphasis on the rights of minorities, women's rights, and also minorities within Norwegian society in school. And I think that the emerging critical thinking about how the Norwegian state tried to nationalize the Sami population by bringing children to internal schools and not allowing them to speak their mother language during recess or at school at all. Everybody had to speak Norwegian to critically address that part of Norwegian history, also within the school system. It's at least a partially success story. Another example that's more recent is that the Norwegian are a country that is obsessed with the Second World War, so that we have in common with Russia at least. And the history writing in Norway about the Second World War has been very one-dimensional for many, many years. And recently, maybe last 15, 20 years, we have been much more focused on the critical aspects, all the gray zones between the collaborators and the resistors. And I think that is also an example of how history teaching can prepare students for their critical thinking, of course, but also to view their own society from a different perspective that they are used to.
Thank you so much. And Valentina mentioned in her presentation that the history teaching get a greater focus in the higher education system as well. And from this year, students at the Russian universities, despite their specialization, will they will have to study history. And there are also other developments in the higher education system in Russia. And I would like to pass the floor to Inna to talk about this.
Thank you, Larissa. Thank you, Anders. I mean, it's so striking that all these things are happening at the same time. We are talking about Norway passing from nationalist understanding of the reality to more universalist, and at the same time, Russia is launching a full-scale war against Ukraine and moving into this vortex of darkness and its own demise. And I mean, honestly, the history textbooks that Larissa mentioned probably, I mean, we'll wake up soon and we'll see that there is no longer word history. It probably would be textbook of greatness of Russia, which very well might be the case. And so in the situation when time is reversing and the space is shrinking, and if we look at Russia, we see that it's not just returning to the Soviet times, but this is a full-scale renaissance that we haven't seen before of the security services and the total control. So we've just seen very quickly the state passing from the authoritarian state to probably, it's safe to say, totalitarian state. If we listen to historians, people like Richard Pipes, he was not ever optimistic about Russia becoming a democratic country. And he predicted this, I mean, not the war, but the renaissance of security services in the early 90s. He said that this is what is going to be happening, and divinization of the country. So to you, Denise, I know you as a philosopher and political scientist, and you've been teaching critical thinking till very recent in Russia. And your story is a very graphic example of what is happening when a critical and independent mind clashes with the system. So and interestingly, this story is kind of flawless. It has all the elements to it. So it's denunciation by a colleague after your post on the internet where you spoke about shameful and vile war. You also mentioned Belarus and the Third Reich, so it's kind of perfect example. So after the denunciation, it was a dismissal and forced leave. I will also want to mention your own article that you wrote for a friendly source, The Riddle, in 2019, when you said that Russia launching this war on back then internet freedoms is a very short-sighted thing to do, because in the long term it will have consequences, political and economical. So what is your take on that? Did you see this coming? What is happening with the higher education today? And would you do the same thing if you go back to that day with that very posting on Facebook?
Thank you, Ina. I will dive in Russian because of my expression needs. То есть.
I would suggest systemic discussion about what is happening. First and foremost, I would emphasize several things currently happening in the education as a whole. There is a tendency for isolation noted by everyone, but it didn't start yesterday. Even in 2010, you can remember how they through licensing and increasing quality of education, they destroyed all the independent higher education institutions. This trend could be noted long ago. It happened slowly, it happened gradually, but with time it was very difficult for independent education to survive. As soon as the active war started after the 24th of February, these processes accelerated a lot. And now even certain places that were kept no longer exist. Liberal arts faculties of state universities have been closed. Some other formations have been closed, and we no longer see any free education. Russia left balloon system. It broke international contacts, often not on her own. Some were broken not by its initiative, but we all understand very well what has happened. And the second important point, in my opinion, I have to say that everything I'm going to speak about, those are parts of the system that support each other. It's like one unit. You have to understand it. Secondly, this is the destruction, literally, of the system of education of Russia as such, because we speak more about grassroots propaganda than about education. What is currently happening, this ideologization and militarization of education, and making it serve the interests of keeping power and conducting war, destroys the education itself by several methods. First, of course, this is destroying independence and motivation to study. It destroys the possibility to discuss issues. It destroys the independence of a teacher. It destroys their openness to new concepts. Moreover, there is another very negative phenomena that we have to note. This is a restoration of denunciation culture. This also destroys the system of education, making it basically unable to function. because loyalty is evaluated more than professional qualities. It's not important how good a scientist you are or how good a teacher you are. If you are not loyal to the system, you lose your position, and you might even be persecuted. So basically, it destroys education as a structure. In the same way, it destroys the motivation of pupils and students to learn anything, because they are denied the opportunity to move further based on their academic success. It's enough to simply be loyal, and which brings to double thinking, to readiness to follow some formal concepts to fit within propaganda cliches instead of openness, honesty, and truly achieving academic successes. As it has been mentioned, academic success is no longer important. All of that hinders development. All of that will cost Russia its future. It will lead to Russia lagging behind, first of all, in liberal arts and humanitarian disciplines, which will be catastrophic, I believe. What else is important? It's important that such an environment on its own becomes the environment where people get socialized, going through school, through the universities. In such an education environment, these students are either traumatized or cynical. In any case, this will be a person who is not ready to defend their own values, who might even not have them, or it's a broken person. So this destroys the society as such in Russia. So we can say that the current tendencies in Russian education have no connection to national interests in reality, because they evidently harm it, which is paradoxical. Something that is portrayed as the defense of Russian Federation from external enemies suddenly, in reality, becomes the main way of the destruction and harm of to the Russian Federation. I think you are able to draw your own conclusions what it means, but here it's very important to emphasize these issues, I think. Unfortunately, what we see is that Russian education becomes a destructive instrument for all the above-mentioned reasons. It's a tool that, for the sake of propaganda, destroys the future of the country. I think that would be it from me. If you have questions, I will gladly answer them.
Well, I wanted to say something on a positive note, but there is no one. I believe it's safe to say that the educational system in Russia is more or less broken beyond repair, at least at this point. So we may forget about international exchange, independence, elections of deans and rectors. We passed that point. We had a comment from Anders, and then I would like to go back to you with one question. So now over to you, Anders.
Yes, thank you very much both for your insights. I just had one short question to you that's maybe not a short answer, but you said that the changes that is now being done are in the long term and the short term against the national interests of Russia. Could then the changes that we now see in the education system see as also a weakness of the regime? do they realize that the sentiments that they want or the wish that the Russian population actually had, they have realized that they do not have? And this is also a sign of a regime realizing its own weaknesses.
Here I would answer as following to your question. Yes, first of all, of course, the regime tries to cover its inefficiency, its dysfunction in this way, and their personal interests that are behind the political and military events. There are certain beneficiaries within the regime of all these events. Moreover, in long term, of course, it will weaken the regime itself, because it will create the doublethink, meaning that trying to raise patriotism is oxymoron. If you want to raise patriotism, it means it's non-existent. If you have to bring up patriotism, it means people do not understand what do they have to be patriots of. So instead of patriotism, as a result, you will have doublethink, meaning saying right words but thinking something else. And in this sense, the regime is creating a big practice of cynical mind, which will result in functioning like Soviet thinking, when everyone knows it's, beg your pardon, a bullshit, but you have to simply publicly say correct things. But on private level, people just simply care of their personal interest. This is what destroyed the Soviet Union. And it seems to me we have the same trajectory here that is confidently followed by Russian educational system.
Thank you, Denise. I can't say that the return of a Soviet man is a good thing, although we know what we are dealing with, and there are good studies by Levada Center. We all read them. And as we see, the educational system is probably entering in its palliative phase. But something that I wanted to pick up with you, you said either cynical or traumatized. I think that the educational system is not just the system. It has at least two elements to it, right? It's the state, but also it's the people. And we just had a seminar, and the founder of our school, Lena Nemirovskaya, rightly pointed out one important thing, that if what is about to happen is going to happen, then we will probably are facing the situation where we will have at least 2 or 3 lost generations, where only fittest will survive. So on one hand, it gives us probably new bright thinkers, dissidents, poets, bright biographies, but it does give us negative selection and lost generations. So my question is to you, Denise, and you, Yuri, about the community. There is the community. Do you feel it? How strong it is? Because I'm adamant that there are people in Russia who are still resisting and are going to resist, be that a silent protest or an open protest, and we cannot round them up to 0. So probably the main focus now should be not how bad the situation is, but what can we do to those still resisting, to those still keeping the flame? How can this community be supported? And how, and a question to the audience and our Norwegian colleagues, how can it be possibly supported from the outside? If you comment on that.
Okay. Thank you.
I think we need to use the resources of the modern world and modern technologies. Remote education might be possible, and Russia is not completely switched off the global network. Remote education is important, and probably we can create a system that will supply oxygen to this airless atmosphere. And as Yuri said, there is passive resistance, although passive resistance doesn't solve any issues. However, it causes frictions in the system, and it is a very useful practice because it makes the system lose traction. We need to support those in Russia. We need to supply them with the information. We need to help them orient themselves. We need to help them to feel good and to remain normal, because now this derealization and blurry borders of the normal are the main problems, because they live in an atmosphere filled with propaganda and filled with real threats to their health and life. So we need to do everything we can to help these people remain themselves, and then every one of them may also support the others. I think that's the best thing we can do now, because this generation's lost is a fact, unfortunately. I would like to add the following. It does look like the late Soviet Union, and I remember it from my childhood. Like no one cared about what they heard on TV. There is nothing to do, and we simply continue our lives. And there is also underground publishing, some kind of underground movement. But now there are wider opportunities to inform people about everything that happens in the world and everything that happens outside. It's very important to continue doing that, and it's important to say that there are protest movements. Every day there are anti-war graffiti on the walls in the street, and there are teachers who disagree with everything. And the Alliance of Teachers, the trade union, they do a very important work, and they explain how to oppose. And they inform parents that, for example, they can write statements, an application to the school saying that they don't want their child to attend this conversation about important topics. That will prevent from further pressure from the state. And we can mention the initiative of Maya Bulanova. The initiatives are different, and Maya Bulanova, school principal in Moscow, who actually complained to the police about one pupil's mother who submitted this statement about non-attendance of these conversations. But then Maya Bulanova received very negative feedback everywhere. We need to inform people about the protests. We need to inform and to say there are people around you who disagree, and there are now much wider opportunities to get this information. If we compare it to the late 70s, when radio was the only source of information for many people. I think we are facing very long work ahead of us.
The difference and similarity with the late Soviet period, the late Soviet men had the luxury to live as if no war was happening, but wars were happening. Afghanistan and then Chechen war. And I think what we have today is partly the price of society being silent and being blind back then. And I don't think we have that luxury anymore. I think the war is here, and you rightly said that it's very important to draw as much attention as possible to the protest and to the protest against the war, not just the state.
In my opinion, as you said, it's very important to emphasize the price, the cost of the war for every household and every region. Many pro-war patriotic initiatives get established as the state propaganda after someone tried that. For example, this ceremony of raising the flag, the beginning was in Tver region when several schools decided to do so, and now it is nationwide. The war is ongoing. Coffins arrive to every city, every district. And the sooner they understand it, in the regions, not in Moscow, where life has always been comfortable, just to keep people silent.
Approach, but again, I'd say that the price that people are going to pay is not just the coffins that they will receive. The price is for our children to pay for the next 2, 3, how many generations. I see, Denit, you want to add something, but I think we give the floor to Anders now to comment, and then we can come back to you, and I think we'll open the floor for questions. So if there are any questions in the audience, please be ready.
I could just speak from the Norwegian perspective, and I think the work that we are doing today and the Wergeland Centre is doing is extremely important in showing dissidents in Russia that they are not alone. The problem in Norway is that most Norwegians do not know that these dissidents actually are that active and working so hard that we are getting testimonies from here. The media coverage in Norway and what we learn about the Russian situation or Russian history in school is almost non-existent. There were media reports on the huge demonstrations, and usually an oppositionally politician like Navalny is sometimes covered in Norwegian news media. But my impression is that most Norwegians think that all Russians, or at least 95% of Russians, are supportive of Putin, that they believe in that this is the right way to go. And we try to change this in our education at teacher education here in Oslo Met. We try to teach about Russian history. We try to teach about contemporary Russia. We travel to Russia with our students. We visit universities in St. Petersburg. We visit schools in St. Petersburg as well. But all this has become much more difficult. We have not been able to do that in the past few years, obviously. So, but what we need in the Norwegian society is more knowledge about that this. The Russian society is divided, and that these oppositional voices exist, and that they are much more deeply rooted in society than what we get the impression here. And I'm no expert on other countries, but I think that this is similar in other Western democracies as well. They believe that there is not possible to change this from within, because most of the Russian population are supportive of the regime.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's a general situation, but it's actually down to us to make the protest and resistance more visible. And we are doing all we can to make it work. And thank you and Wergeland Centre for all the support, because it is really crucial to know that people care out there. Somebody cares. It's a game changer. Do we have questions in the audience? How do we? Yeah, you, and I think we collect a few questions and then we'll let you all comment. So you,
Если позволите, не вопрос, а мнение.
It's not a question. I'd like to express my opinion, if you allow. Andrei Suslov, former professor of Perm University of Pedagogics Education and member of the board of Perm Regional Memorial, also working in the civil society. I'd like to comment on three aspects about education. First of all, the educational system is extremely inert. It cannot change at once, and that makes the situation a little ambiguous. The second aspect is that in this educational system there is the cult of imitation. Imitations, they can be good or bad, advantages or disadvantages, and in some schools there are imitations that they follow the instructions of the authorities, but they do not. They simply report that they did that. And everything depends on people. Many teachers know that when they closed the door to a classroom, they are alone with their students. They can say whatever they can. They understand the situation. They cannot be 100% frank, but they still express their opinion. I do agree with everything Denis and Yuri said. About history textbooks, I studied school textbook in history. They are allowed by the Ministry of Education. Textbooks of 2016, 2019. I have 3 scientific publications on them. If anyone is interested, I can tell more about that. But the summary is that the modern history of Russia for the last 30 years, political, social and economic situation, in some textbooks is described and reflected in different ways. But the main idea, the main message is that the crazy 90s, then more stable 2000, and then Putin coming on a white horse and everything becomes great. But if we look at the foreign policy, we can see this old tradition coming from the Soviet textbooks. No mistakes in the foreign policy were committed. Our foreign policy is correct and aimed at protecting the Russian national interests. It's interesting how the Crimea annexion is presented in these textbooks. At first, we see that Nazis seized the power in Kiev, and then the people of Crimea were against it. They carried out a referendum and decided to join Russia. As about Russian military in Crimea, there is not a word about it. And in the textbook of 2016, edited by Medinsky, says that we simply went and took it because we needed to implement national interests. So foreign policy repeats the messages of propaganda, and that's the context that we see. And now the information about the current war will be added in line with the current propaganda. Thank you.
Lady in the third row, please. Yep, here. Thanks.
My name is Helene Lund. Thank you very much to the panels for a very interesting discussion. I have a question regarding, because loyalty and militarization has been mentioned, but the religious dimension of the understanding of patriotism and the lack of perhaps having the history of enlightenment within the religious traditions in Russia. Could anyone comment on how important the religious dimension of patriotism is used in school? And the reason I mention it is that I once had a lesson on the Russian Orthodox doctrine on social teaching from 2000, and it has an interesting chapter on how the Russian thinking is about the Christianization support of military force, and in that text it's a lot of reference to Alexander Nevsky and also to this link. The reason I mention it is that in a Norwegian society, religion isn't very important, and in a Soviet Union time, it should probably not be important. But even Stalin used religious dimension and history to win the Second World War, and Putin is using this thing. So, just a comment: how is this covered by the Russian education? Thank you.
Great, thank you. We had more questions, right? Over there. Yep.
Firstly, I would like to support Andrei. Oh, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Elena Vandasheva from Transparency International Russia, and I also work at Higher School of Economics for 16 years. I was fired because of my anti-war position. But anyway, I would like to mention that Russian higher education hasn't died. And I need to outline that there are a lot of teachers and students with anti-war positions and who share the same values and democratic values, and they couldn't disappear just because the authorities, the government, claimed that Russia right now should be isolated, and that's why we need to continue to communicate with them. And I will give one example how we work with Russian students in the framework of the Laboratory of University Transparency. So they monitor the government at universities, and we teach them how to provide investigations, for instance. So we give some certain tools, and they are involved in the activity all around Russia. And they make some certain projects that can improve the government at universities. They can increase transparency and accountability of authorities at universities, and it's still possible. I guess if we will suggest some certain tools and some certain instruments that can be useful and helpful, it will work, and we shouldn't just turn out and claim that we will not communicate with you. So that's my position. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions, or do we go back to our panelists? Yes, please. Over there.
Hello. Thank you very much for amazing talk. I am Ismail Sadlozoda from Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. My question is, how do you see in this general picture of what's going on in Russia and in Ukraine, how do you see in this whole picture the relation between the center and periphery in Russia in the sphere of education? Do the republics take and teach the way the center wants, or do we see any resistance or any change in the periphery? Thank you.
We're done with the questions, right? So we now go back to you. If you could all comment, and Larissa will also have a comment on the religious question about religion. So yeah, we'll start.
Russian Orthodox Church, unfortunately, is not an independent organization. And in general, if we talk about the general role of the Russian Orthodox Church in all these activities, it provides the function of ideological support based on religious opinions. And it is not there is no single opinion for members of the Russian Orthodox Church. We can even see schism, a breakup in the members, and there are those who in the Russian Orthodox Church who are against the war. But I would say that Russian Orthodox Church is trying to replace a party and ideology, and also in education, unfortunately. The lessons related to religion were introduced a long time ago. There are possibilities to choose secular ethics or another religion such as Buddhism or Islam, but teachers who would be able to teach that are not available. So most often students are faced with the choice of secular ethics or Orthodox Christianity, apart from the regions where Buddhism or Islam is the main religion. Unfortunately, Russian Orthodox Church also takes part in the war and in the propaganda, despite the all these current differences. Unfortunately, the Russian Orthodox Church is now serving the regime. And maybe I can answer the second question at once. Yes, please do. If I understood the question correctly, I couldn't hear very well, I'm sorry. If I understood your question correctly, the difference between there is no difference between educational programs in the center and in the periphery. The state now is doing their best to ensure a standard, and a single educational standard was recently adopted, and it prevents even private schools from deviating from this standard. Of course, there are some specific aspects in the regions, but it is not implemented in the education as far as I know. May I add something very briefly about the center and the periphery? It seems that now considering these new initiatives, militarizing and others, before they become the general state policy, they are being tested in the regions. And I'm talking about military, pro-military events, camps, Cossack movement. At first, they appear in the regions, and probably they are inspired to be launched in the periphery, and then it is transferred to other regions. The educational system is rather inert, and if there are some initiatives, they are institutionalized on the following year, and one more year later they can be modified as common parts of the curriculum. Now, for example, uniform is planned to be introduced, and these initiatives come from regions. It's easier to implement these initiatives. As to religion, I think it's important to say about this disruption between the hierarchs, about the church authorities who will continue supporting the war, and local communities, including religious communities, just as it goes with the educational community. I think resistance will be formed around specific schools where the community of parents will try to preserve democratic values. Like the school in Moscow, for example, where my children attend, is trying to preserve these values. And I think religious communities will appear and they will try to act against.
On the religious studies from 2023, the course of the fundamentals of religion and ethics will be mandatory at Russian schools. And we have one question from the net. Yeah, I will read it, and maybe someone of you could pick it up. How and what should be the plan through school, university, media to educate people about democracy, that people have a voice, and not to go the way to put an alternative person like Putin in power?
Maybe we start with this time. Yeah, sure. Firstly, about the difference between the center and the periphery. The support of the Putin regime is stronger in the regions than there are in the urban centers, of course. And there is a generational difference and there is a geographical difference, usually because of the way to get information that doesn't come from the regime is much more difficult in the regions. They are much more dependent on state television for their information about the world. So the support of the regime is much stronger, and also then support of the war is much stronger in the regions than it is in the urban centers. The religious issue, I don't have any expert knowledge about, but my thought is that this sounds very similar to what the position the Orthodox Church had previously in the pre-Soviet era. But could you perhaps expand on, are there any differences between the role the Orthodox Church plays now and the role it played in the pre-Soviet period? Are there any major differences, or is it just a return to the old normalcy of the Orthodox Church influence?
We have to wrap up because we're running out of time. If any of you, if any of you would want to add something really, really briefly. Microphone.
Sorry,
I would briefly answer this question you have just asked, what to do, how to teach democracy. You have to support people, support horizontal connections, support communities. If you know that there are some people, there is some school or some community that keeps something, you have to invest there, help them, and try to develop this horizontal network. Well, basically it's an underground. As to coming back of Orthodox Church to certain normalcy, to the way it was, I think it will really depend on future developments of the events.
To finish this conversation on words about solidarity and support, and it's been a great conversation. Thank you, all our brilliant panelists. Thank you, Larissa.
Thank you. Please find your way back to us. And I again remind you and urge you not to run away from 12 to 1. Those of you who are here at Litteraturhuset, there's really a space for further communication and discussion, so use this possibility. I would like to say that we have looked now at what is in a way and a little bit to what was. And the next panel is more about, we talked a little bit also in the first panel, what can be done. What we are observing in the past several months that a lot of highly professional people, a lot of civil society organizations, a lot of media outlets are currently in exile. They have been forced to flee Russia. We have heard from the educators who are not able anymore due to their active stance to stay there, and we see this increasingly happening. Our aim for this session was really to consider what can those who are living out of the country and do for the country of origin, and how can they contribute. And this is a conversation about diaspora. And as I say the word diaspora, I realize that in the community there is a discussion about, if we talk about those organizations that are in exile from Russia, what is the search for terminology? So we will touch upon this as well. But before we go to looking at what can we do to support perhaps those who are now out of the country and those who are there in the country through education and concrete activities, we have invited Erlend Påske, the senior researcher from the Institute for Social Research in Norway, to present for us a kind of framework. What is actually the role of diaspora in terms of promotion of democracy? Can diasporas be agents of democracy in general, not just through education? What can be the pitfalls and what are the prospects? So Erlend, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the applause as well. So hesitant in the beginning. I'm a migration scholar, so I'm not an expert on Russia. And as was said now, I'm here to bring a kind of broader framework to the discussion. So I think first of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Thank you also so much to the brilliant panelists in the first panel. It was both deeply moving and also very kind of analytically clear. So I'm following up on some of the things that were said now in the previous panel, which I think ties in nicely with this. Sorry? Oh, yeah. Now we're talking. Sorry? Right. So my talk will be divided into 5 sections. First, I'll kind of try to put what's happening in Russia in a broader global framework. Then I'll talk briefly about the notion of a diaspora. What does it mean, and what are the prospects and pitfalls of mobilizing the diaspora as an agent of democracy? And I'll close it off with very short policy recommendations or policy conclusions from my side. I think the global state of democracy is in a bit of peril. You see from various international rankings using a variety of methodologies that democracy is in decline. That both relates to the notion of democratic erosion, which is what's happening in states where democracy is firmly consolidated, but still eroding, and also in the sense of democratic backsliding, which is more serious. Countries moving from being democracies to being more authoritarian. And of course, what we're gathered to talk about here is the invasion of Ukraine and the Russian context. Is also illustrative and also reflective and constitutive of kind of the insurgence of traditional geopolitics now, the great power competition between Russia and the US and the EU and China, the imperial ambitions in Russia, and also the kind of the long-term diplomatic fallout from Ukraine. So if we look back from the 1980s until now, like this graph from the IDES Institute in Sweden, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, illustrates the kind of steady decline of democracy worldwide. So if you look at the dark green, the dark green signifies the number of countries where that are moved towards democracies, or like further strengthen democracies, whereas the dark red indicates the number of countries that are moved the opposite direction. Like so here, when it's dark, it outnumbers the number of democracies outnumbers the number of autocracies, and with the dark red, it's the opposite. So it's not a positive image. Here's another graph showing it from the Freedom House this year's report. It points out that there have been now 16 consecutive years of decline in global freedom, and 60 countries got less free last year, as opposed to 25 which got more free. So the number of people living in designated free countries is now only 20%, a pretty sharp decline from just a couple of years ago. So what does this have to do with the notion of diasporas? Well, partly because people are moving from less free countries to more free countries, and that kind of enables a discussion of the diaspora as a democratizing agent, right? So if you move from a less free country to a more free country, you're free to kind of engage in homeland-oriented political activity, right? Like so, diasporic political activity. So what is a diaspora then? This is like a difficult concept for migration scholars. But this definition is old and has kind of stood the test of time. So a social collectivity that exists across state borders, so it has to be a border-crossing migration involved, and that has succeeded over time to sustain a collective national, cultural, or religious identity through a sense of internal cohesion, so a sense of groupness, a sense of shared identity, and sustain ties with a real or imagined homeland. I'll use the word homeland here throughout the discussion, even though it's problematic in a sense. The second feature is that this diaspora displays an organizational ability. It's capable of addressing the collective interests of members through transnational links. So transnational in this context means stretched out in a social space that crosses state borders. So these are kind of the definitional features of a diaspora. They're also linked to the precise things that makes the diaspora a resource. It has localized knowledge, know-how, language skills, cultural skills. It can mediate. It can act as a broker. It's aware of the opportunities. I mean, it was well illustrated by the previous panel. The value of talking with people straight from the field who know what they're talking about and who have this kind of local knowledge, and also local networks. It was raised in the previous field that you have to know which schools to work with because it's underground. I mean, this is precisely the things where you don't have that knowledge otherwise. You need the diaspora or local partners. All right. So if you look at the diaspora isn't like a ready-made thing that does ready-made activities. There has to be a kind of enabling environment. You need factors that enable democratic activities and other political engagements. So one is the state policies that are conducive to diasporic engagement. This includes both the host state, so as Norway, for instance, and the origin state, as Russia. Not so conducive, maybe. And the other is the intergenerational transmission of of a political awareness, of identities, of political orientations. The diaspora has to sustain this over time, so bringing it across generations is important. People, I mean, the diaspora also just consists of individuals and people, so there needs to be some kind of organizational infrastructure that brings people together, allows them to talk together, maybe like a clear line of a clear sense of hierarchy. You need spokespersons, you need a division of labor, designated tasks, and so on. And then it's also interesting how the diaspora might be potentially political. I think this might also apply for the Russian diaspora, although I don't know. But that there are Russians in the diaspora who might engage in political activity, even though they haven't done so before, triggered by an event such as the invasion of Ukraine, for instance. I mean, that you have these kind of transformative events, vital conjectures, they're called in the literature. So this can be in the homeland, and it can be in the host state. So ironically, like with the Arab Spring, for instance, the Arab diaspora in Switzerland was mobilized by the Swiss inactivity. So the lack of Swiss governmental action was the triggering event that kind of motivated political mobilization. I think I hope I'm not talking too fast for the interpreter. Is it okay? Good. All right. So I just want to, it easily gets very abstract, so I just want to give some concrete examples of what diasporas have been found to do in the scholarly literature. One is, of course, the framework here is that it's often the diasporas we talk about, they move from relatively poor countries to relatively rich countries, so they can use their wealth to support certain fractions and organizations and pro-democratic forces in the homeland. So, for instance, sending remittances to Somali civil society and human rights activists, that's one example. Another, maybe more specifically relevant to this, is in Bosnia, where Bosnian diasporas in Sweden and the UK lobbied to change school curricula in Bosnia, and also set up, I think, a kind of a hybrid orphanage and school, and lobbied to. Protested also in Bosnia, went back to protest outside the governmental building, and argued for changing the kind of the way history was taught in Bosnia. All right. And in Hungary, like we're increasingly authoritarian, pro-democratic diaspora groups that are engaging in politics and kind of writing op-eds in political magazines and that kind of thing. Of course, Russia, we don't even need to talk about. Everybody knows what's going on there. In Iran, recently there was this event where a woman, Mahsan Amin, was beaten up and killed by the Iranian moral police. It's kind of example of an event that can trigger diasporic action, as it has. In Lebanon, there's been electoral campaigning among the diaspora, like very kind of close collaboration between diasporic groups and homeland political movements. This kind of alliances is also, of course, a kind of definitional trademark of diasporas, that they find people to work with, often on the grassroots level, but not always on the grassroots level. I've worked myself on Iraqi Kurdistan, where I think, like, at least when I was there doing fieldwork, I think more than half of the ministers in government were so-called de-diasporized. They came from the diaspora back to Iraqi Kurdistan to run the country. All right. So, moving on towards pitfalls, there's the risk that both the host state, such as Norway, or the origin state, such as Russia, seeks to co-opt the diaspora, so to control it, rather than to partner with it. So, of course, I mean, you have this is always a risk when a state wants to work with a civil society actor and can offer resources and can kind of also withdraw resources. So divide and rule through patronage. This also goes for the homeland state. I mean, Russia also, we talk a lot about Russian control, but we also need to talk about Russian co-optation. I think like the channeling of resources to those who are regime friendly. So I mean, these things go together. You can think of the diaspora as a useful proxy, a puppet in a sense, like making the state a puppeteer, a puppet master, instead of an equitable partnership based on respect and mutual dialogue. So that's the first of the pitfalls that I will talk about. The second is organizational issues. It sounds all very good to work with the diaspora. I mean, who wouldn't want to work with the diaspora? But for policymakers and decision makers like tasked with doing that, there brings up certain logistical and administrative issues. How do you get it right? How do you know whom to work with? How do you ensure accountability and results when you're basically working with non-professionals and volunteers, maybe? So there's this is what the decision makers kind of are used to working with, very nice and tidy, and this is like the messy empirical reality of a diasporic network. It's not always like this, but it can be like this. In a sense, this is also, so it's just like it frames the discussion, like how do you also encourage the diaspora to organize in such a way that it can be a valuable partner? I mean, there's also a responsibility on that side. Finally, there's a third pitfall. I think there's a kind of a naive assumption that now, like, people can work online, they're free to speak, they work from safe diasporic groups work from safe havens such as Oslo or Stockholm or wherever. But we see increasingly a tendency of transnational repression. So, like the naivety of cyberspace as a kind of safe haven or Europe as a safe haven, that's long gone. Like this has been going on for a while. As states become increasingly authoritarian, they also become increasingly skilled at using these tools of transnational repression. And of course, this isn't done by all origin states, and it's not done in all host states. But it's common enough. Also in Norway, there have been clear examples of some of these things, at least. Maybe especially the digital spyware and surveillance, but also this targeting by proxy, which is really, really nasty. So this is important, I think, to know also for policymakers that there needs to be, this is part of their responsibility as a host state to offer a kind of a protection, maybe offer digital tools or offer awareness of how these things work, how they can be avoided. There are a number of steps that host states can take, especially maybe if they work with diasporas themselves actively. So these are the three key takeaways for policymakers, in my view. One is, even though it might be logistically and administratively difficult to work with diasporas, it's absolutely a requirement. We live in the 21st century. It's like you have to use this resource that are sitting in your sitting room, in a sense. And also it fits with at least the previous government's integration strategy. Although they focus on development, which I think is, there's a very much an obvious case to be made for democratization as much as development. If development is a desirable, democracy is as much a desirable. The other is, as I mentioned, to protect diasporas actively against transnational repression. This can be done in a number of ways. And I think part of the reason why it's important is also that the most resourceful, the most transnationally connected parts of the diasporas are precisely the ones who are most likely to self-censor if they feel threatened, because they have so much to lose. If you've cut all ties with the homeland, with the previous homeland, and you're fully kind of orienting yourself to the new to the host state, then you lose out on some of the skills and networks and diverse forms of capitals that are politically useful. So this is also a rationale for protection in a sense. And finally, it's good to have clear policy objectives in this field, but the nature of working with diaspora also calls for flexibility, seeing how things go, seeing where networks lead, and kind of maximizing the results through such a flexible approach where diasporas are partners and not service providers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Comment number 3. Thank you very much, Helen, for this fantastic presentation and for giving us the framework. I think many questions that you raised here in terms of terminology already is relevant. I see that there are questions already coming up. I wonder if we can take the questions after the panel, because we will have the panel discussion now, and then we can have the more questions to all the panelists. Okay. I will like to introduce the panelists who will be joining us now. It is Evgenia Khoroltsova, the trainer in human rights education from the Human Rights Academy, Menneskerettigheter here in Norway, and at the same time a board member of Smorodina. And this is a movement here for democratic development in the Russian Federation. Ina Sangadjieva, the Department Director for Europe and Central Asia from the Norwegian Helsinki Committee. Welcome. And Selma Bradberg, the Vice President of the Norwegian Student and Academics International Assistance Fund, SAIHO in Norwegian. And finally, a young, starting journalist, Maria Ulazovskaya, who works more with social media or YouTube channel from Novaya Gazeta. So I think that I will probably need to tower a little bit above you. I can use this microphone. Yes, it's on. Fantastic. Then I join you here. Okay. So thank you all for joining us today here. And I do know that we have a limited amount of time and we have fantastic panelists. So let's try to do our best. I would actually like to speak about something that Erlen commented on, because he said both about the fact that diaspora can be an agent of democracy, but they can also face repressions from the state, and this can be a dangerous environment. And we also had this discussion on who is a diaspora or how we define diaspora. I would actually like to give the first chance to Eugenia to tell a little bit about the movement of Smorodina. How did it come about? What are perhaps the priorities, and also what about terminology? And also this? I know we talked about this, Eugenia, about this horizontal networks. If you could touch upon these issues.
Well, yes, I can try. Hi, everybody. I basically prepared mine in English, but maybe I talk Russian because I'm not using Russian every day any longer. Может быть, по-русски я хочу говорить вдруг.
As to horizontal networks, it was a very good description. The word itself, diaspora, I can say, based on the experience of Smorodina, this word pushes away some people, but we interpret it as keeping collective culture, language, and some people have this attitude to Russia, so the word homeland repulses them. Diaspora is global concept, but it describes Russian-speaking community that have any relations to Russia, grew up there, worked there, or something like that. Estus Smorodina, yes, it's a play of words. It's like small homeland if we translate it from Norway to Russian. So it's not some big territory, it's a small place, small territory that you carry within your heart. And it sometimes pushes you based on some historical processes to do something. Like, for example, now the war in Ukraine and military aggression causes you to come back to your small homeland in your heart. That's why this title. Well, I wouldn't call it as a movement, because it is more like a community of people who not necessarily feel as members of Russian Federation from their whole life. So we come back here to global or national identity. Today, the younger generation doesn't simply identify as Russians, especially if they had the opportunity to study abroad, have friends and living in this modern society. Even during such a barbarian war on the territory of Ukraine done by Russian Federation. So this is a network of people who do not like systematic organizations. They just work and live in this society. They have their families. Some lived here for longer than others, but they are interested by what is happening in their homeland. The war in Ukraine really touches many people. And then you have the need to voice it. You have the need to go outside in front of parliament in Oslo and Norway and stare there with a poster. Yes, I am from Russia, but I am on Ukrainian side. I support Ukraine. It has the right to exist. And thus we meet many other people who simply were going by or also protested there. So that's how this chaos of diaspora takes form. The war in Ukraine has been a stimulus for the last 8 months. But most probably, when Navalny came back to Russia and was arrested in Moscow and put in jail, it caused weird feelings of people. It's 21st century. We used to be in that country, and we are still. We still need to tell people that, yes, there are tortures in Russia, there are arrests in Russia. So it touched a lot of young people also who live in Norway. I remember people who I encountered in my training of human rights in the last 15 years in the Russian Federation when we worked with Andrei Soslov. When I speak in Norway on behalf of Smorodina, I try to give them quotes, especially of young people who are still on the territory of Russian Federation, who I encountered in Perm or in Tambovsk region or Vitebsk region, in small places, not in Moscow and St. Petersburg.
It all gives you some kind of connection, and it gives energy to speak up in our Norwegian society.
Transitioning from language to language, I use English maybe this time. Can I ask you an additional question? You also take part and observe the different initiatives from different countries that are engaged in such work as your own. Can you say a few words about that? And I know that yesterday we received some interesting news. If you want to comment on that as well.
Да. Ну, если будем продолжать использовать слово диаспора, давайте будем использовать слово диаспора. Хорошо. Ну вот, Лиза.
Yes, if we use the word diaspora, let's use the word diaspora, and we can see the representative of Russian-speaking diaspora in Germany. It is a chaotic horizontal structure of people who keep in touch, who chat in the evening, at night, about organizing a joint event when these mass murders and mass tombs were discovered in Bucha near Kiev. And yeah, that's how this network functions. If we talk about reaction of Russian authorities to us, yesterday, at least 4 diasporas in the Netherlands, in the USA, where else? In Germany, Demokratia, so-called, and in Denmark, it was claimed that the investigation of their activities was completed. Okay, it was completed. They were investigated due to mingling in the affairs of Russia, because of their alternative opinion, actually, of the events in Russia. And they believe that they claim it is interfering with Russians' internal affairs. And we are accused of recruiting anti-Russia Russians. If that's a crime for Russian authorities, we need to talk about that. And that's why it's important in our local societies, communities, we need to use the opportunity to talk. We need to show how these interpretations by Russian authorities affect my life, affect the Russian-speaking community in Germany, represented here by Lisa. I know that's actually a compliment for some representatives of the diaspora, although it is sad and it will continue, and that's not something new. That's not a new reality for many people, let's be frank. There are tortures, arrests, rapes in Russia. People are humiliated in Naftazaks, or how do you call it, the detention facilities. That's something that is perceived as norm. We need to talk about it. And only a small group of people, advocates, journalists, had this privilege to talk. But now it all affects our life, our children's life, because they grow up in Germany, in Norway, in Denmark, and other places. The issue of language identity, graphic identity of their region will not disappear. We need to start talking about that. We need to stick our head out and to show our face, and it will be better for everyone. Thank you, Evgenia.
English, as we say that this event is in English, and I know that those following us online can only hear the English version. So let's try to. I try to this. You are free to choose whichever language you want. This is just for me. I would like to ask Ina, because this is I would make a little bridge from diaspora a little bit to the education, because we talked about this as well. Eugenia spoke about something we can talk about, this awareness-raising activities. I would like to give you a kind of double question. We have the idea of diasporas or active civil communities in exile being as agents of change, not only in terms of what is going on in their country, but also considering what is happening in the countries where they are now. Do you see such examples in your work? And also the double question, we talked with you in preparation for this event about what can be done now, and I think this connects very well to this awareness-raising moments in terms of education. What topics, what issues should we be focusing on? So, a bridge.
Thank you. I will speak English. I actually want to start when answering questions from the context, because that's something I miss. And we should understand, I'm also a political scientist from the University of Oslo. That's why in our work, it's very important to understand the whole puzzle in terms of putting all the bridges in, all the bricks. So, and Russia is going through, to my mind, 3 huge processes, which didn't start now. They haven't started, even for 30 years ago. But the process of the fall of empire, which will follow the decolonization, identity searching, understanding ourselves, understanding our varieties, that who are Russians, like we are 180 ethnical Russians inside Russia. Myself is from Kalmykia, Jenny as well. Second process is the fall of regime, transformation of regime, which would like to preserve status quo. And the regime is based on militarization, propaganda, and the core of the state is violence. Monopoly to use violence against their own people. And the war is a kind of clay. It's the way to preserve legitimacy, that the one who is strong, the one who is, physically strong, is right. And the third, which is important in this context, is the transformation of society, understanding who we are, кто мы, who are we. When Putin talks about we, I myself, who actually comes although from Russia, I don't have this identity, I never had it. And this is also understanding our history, understanding the conflicts, understanding our trauma, because Russian society is very traumatized. Traumatized by repressions, years of repressions, years of darkness. It also traumatized by poverty. 20 million of Russians live in poverty. I just read in the news that in my own Kalmykia, the average salary or in the way how you can live on is 13,000 rubles. It's 1,000 crowns, around that, if you would take it in crowns. So, and that's what is going on inside Russia. I think what is important to do, I think Denise also said it in the first panel, I don't want to repeat, that's also very, I would also agree with all you said. But the most important thing is to that we are in the process to bring back human being inside humans in Russia. Because our regime, Soviet regime, has taken physically the empathy, understand each other, trust to each other, networking, horizontal networking, everything what makes us being human being is away. And the process of understanding it actually started 30 years ago. A lot has been done through 30 years ago. Me and Jenny met each other in Lyceum on the eve of perestroika, and I think maybe it was the education which actually helped me understanding. As we were teenagers, and suddenly we could talk about Gorbachev. Suddenly we could talk about deportations. Suddenly we could talk about what was wrong, and suddenly we understood that we were lying. Everything was a lie, a huge lie. And now back to teachers, how they can then, being a part of the system, which want them to falsify the elections, want them to доносить, don't know what the English word, just forgot, want them to control over children, and use violence. Still, there is a lot of physical violence in South schools education. How they can then preserve themselves? So now I can answer your questions. What to do? What Denise said is very right. I think what is very important to keep on supporting everything which is alive in Russia. It's a lot of what is alive in Russia. Many protests, but the most important are people trying to understand, awakening society, understanding through their pain, through their schizophrenic maybe reality, where there is a very important, nice, I don't know, but there is a book of Norwegian psychologist Thomas Nilsson, the dictatorship of a psychopath, where you've been told to do both ways, right and wrong, and you don't understand what to do because you are being confused. So the role of the teacher is very, very difficult now. But I think in Russia there are still experiences from the 90s, from the teachers, from the, because they have connections to new generations, because they have connections to young souls, it is still possible to do something. And what we can do from here? Again, I said it's very important to support those who are inside. Like Denise said, create oath methodology based on information, whatever we can use to prepare the society to go through this transformation period, because it's very painful. And understand what is going on, not judge, and sometimes maybe forgive, because that's what we need. We don't need to be us and them. Now we understand who is our enemy, and we have one enemy, and we have to unite. Forget maybe about your, where you come from. We have to understand our common goal is bringing human being and human rights back. I mean, even not back. A race starting from the scratch. We have never had this experience at all, I would say. Mm-hmm. And last point, I think what we can do from here is to be democracy ourselves. Mm-hmm. Because we simply cannot teach Russia how to be democracy if we close borders, if we say those Russians are good and those are not. Mm-hmm. We cannot teach human rights education if we cannot speak Russian and cannot tolerate language. Mm-hmm. We should think about how understand in the way Holocaust was understood. What is the repressions of communist regime? How it builds up a human and breaks a human being inside the human being, and understand how these people, of course, now today is 9 months of the war in Ukraine, terrible, really terrible. But imagine that you grow up whole your life without light, gas, electricity, water, nothing for many years. I mean, we should understand these people and maybe bring about this change by actually telling as well here in Norway what is Russian society, understand each other, and then build trust.
Thank you very much, Ina, for this important overview and also for this input. I also think that, as you say, we have, and this is also the part of this event, to raise awareness. So again, thank you all for being here. I agree with you also on the need to explain the communist museum, the communist regime, and what it's like and what we are dealing with, because this is not clearly understood perhaps in many countries. It depends perhaps where you are geographically or how much you know this. But you also said something very, I think, meaningful in terms of empathy and in terms of understanding each other, even though it might be difficult or it might be challenging. And I think this very nicely connects to what we discussed with Selma, because you also work with those who are coming from authoritarian regimes. You work a lot with students, but also with academia. And you also, in our conversations, said that one way of support is really this just understanding and this idea of talking about the guilt. Could you say something about that, and also what you see from other countries? How do you support perhaps those who are coming from these regimes?
Yes, thank you. I think that's very important, and also one of the things we hear from activists who come here to Norway. We support this one program called Students at Risk, where it's a Norwegian program where students who are in danger in their home country and can't finish their studies, they can come to Norway and finish their studies here. There's also an international organization called Scholars at Risk, which is the same thing for scholars. So we are in contact with a lot of students who come to Norway through that program. And one of the things they say is, yes, exactly the thing about solidarity, that's one of the important things we can do. And I think sometimes it sounds very like small and not that important, but actually seeing that there's people other places that are talking about the situation and talking about your country, or seeing that when you come out of jail, for example, that there has actually been students in Norway who have written about your case, for example. And I think here it's also very important to support the diaspora that we have already talked about here today, because we very often see that students and others who come are very engaged also in activism here in Norway. They get engaged in organizations like Amnesty or SAI, and they bring in very valuable knowledge and experiences that I think we can also learn from and use here.
So this idea really that was mentioned before of partners, of really trying to work together, and I read also an article looking into diasporas of Romania, Bulgaria and Poland and their effect on democratization in their countries, and it was actually specified that we can use partners. Our democracies we see are also in decline, so we need all the partners we can get to support our democratic processes. I would like to ask also a question to Maria Lazowska, who is a young journalist, just had to leave in the middle of her studies. And I would like to hear to bridge the question to education. What kind of, and this will be a question for all the panelists, I think, what kind of education do we need? What do we need to keep in mind as we define education, or perhaps our own education practices? Non-formal education practices, something that is called in Russian prosvещение, which is quite encompassing. What kind of universities we need? And the first question would be to Maria, connected to Novaya Gazeta, and the fact that your editor is also connected to the Free University, if I'm saying the name correctly. Could you say some things about perhaps bridging also from your experience, what kind of competences you need as a young journalist that would like to come eventually back to Russia, perhaps, and what kind of education institution is now being created?
Thank you so much. I'd like to add one thing. First, Ina gave me this idea. I grew up in Putin's times. I don't remember anyone else except for him. I attended school, university, the President's Academy. It doesn't mean that I supported this regime. And when I was little, I thought that, as we call him, grandfather Lenin is my actual grandfather. That's the family I grew in. But I always wanted to find something more about education at universities, etc. In Russia, history is being rewritten in Russia. It was already rewritten in the Soviet Union, but now that's the official policy. We can hear that from Putin. The situation is getting better. That's what children, school children, students are taught. Websites are blocked, resources are blocked, and historians are unable to speak. They are put in jail, and we get a distorted picture of the world by Russians. We need to be ready to the fact that when there are changes implemented, we will need to tell people about a different history, and we will face critical reflection. People believe propaganda, but if you say something about Stalin, they would react, I don't believe you, I need to check that. So you can bang the wall with your head for a long time, but we will need non-formal education. About the Free University, 2 years ago, our editor-in-chief Kirill Martynov, the editor-in-chief of Novaya Gazeta, he became a co-founder of academic internet online establishment free of charge, and it was called Free University. That occurred in 2020 when many teachers of the Higher School of Economics were fired and the rector was replaced. What does the Free University do? It provides free higher education. You can donate, but it's not compulsory. And this Free University provides new approach to the facts that are well known. Much deeper, and we have this basic program of history all over the country, but we have these historical workshops that you can never find online, and that's completely free of charge. This year, the Free University has a new website. There are new teachers, 150 teachers, several thousands of students, mostly from Russia, but also from post-Soviet countries. The education is mostly in Russian. There are some English programs, but not many of them. It is all done online. We still need to develop. We need to continue improving, adding things, but as I've already said, and I also said it yesterday and a few days ago, the situation in Russia, it will change. Sooner or later, these clouds will dissipate. I know there are people who don't believe in that, but I do believe. And there are a lot of young people in the Free University. I know many people from there, and it would be great if a young generation has this academic support so that this young generation could return to Russia, because many people left, many students left. They want to return, they want to come back. I want to come back to Russia, and they could do propaganda, but good propaganda of the ideas, of the meanings they received in this academic structure. This is academic education, a basic education for those who want to continue scientific activities or simply get a university diploma. It does not issue a diploma because there is no accreditation, but still it gives great preparation for formal education abroad or in this beautiful Russia of the future. Thank you, Maria. We now see the increase in different educational institutions. And there is a demand that our colleagues from Montenegro have a lot of schools. They need additional educational institutions to be able to accept all the children moving there together with their families. I'd like to ask Selma now.
I wanted to ask you as well, because we had this discussion about the university. What kind of universities, academic institutions should we strive for? What is important for you in your work? What do you promote?
Yes. I think the main thing is that we have to build universities with or based on academic freedom and critical thinking, because if we don't have academic freedom, we will just continue creating propaganda, and we need to build and educate students that are able to think critically. So it means that universities and educational systems have to be autonomous. that they are the ones that decides who should run the universities, for example. Researchers and students are the ones who decide what should be studied. This can't be controlled by the government, and it also means creating universities that are safe, where students feel safe, both from attacks from police, for example, or security forces, but also where you can be yourself, no matter who you are, your the color of your skin, or sexual identity, and so on. You need to be safe in order to also express yourself freely. And I think this is very important because by educating students that are able to think critically, we also build an educational system and students and academics who are able to recognize and see the small steps in the wrong direction. It was mentioned here earlier that these authoritarian shifts, they don't come overnight. It's small things, slowly and step by step. So we also need an educational systems and students and academics that are able to think critically and who can notice these small steps. And I think it's also important that we don't wait. Like Maria mentioned here, hopefully one day we will have a free Russia, for example. There's also many other examples, and I think it's important that we don't wait until that day, because every day that goes, students and young people are losing out on education, and a lot of people were maybe in the midst of their studies, and every day they're losing the knowledge that they already built up. So I think it's important to find ways to react to this immediately. It could be, for example, through the Students at Risk program or other programs that makes it possible for students to finish their studies in other countries. It was mentioned earlier, remote learning platforms. I can also mention an example from Myanmar, because there a lot of people have had to flee the country after the coup in 2020, and many people are now living in Thailand, and the diaspora there has been very important in building alternative education platforms, and where one of them focus areas is also to build leaders for a future and for a Myanmar that will hopefully one day be free again, with a focus on democracy and human rights, but also understanding between different ethnic groups, for example. So I think it's also very important that this is a focus in the education.
Thank you so much. And when we were preparing for this panel, we also talked about a support mechanism to exchange experiences, because we also said that many of those who are forced to flee face some kind of similar characteristics of the authoritarian regime, and try to find some kind of solutions that can be useful. So this sharing across if we say diaspora, I'm still in search of the terminology, to be honest, also. But let's stay with diaspora to find these connections and to share experiences. I give the same questions to Ina, and perhaps to close Eugenia, and then we can have the questions from the audience.
And again, I want to go back to work. Yes, go back to what the context is about. Again, I want to underline that the regime in Russia is very conservative, and the society is much more modernized. And as we say in the Buddhism, the teacher is coming when the student is ready. And the student in Russia is ready. Let me give some numbers, which has been mentioned by Daniel Treisman. He's a political scientist and have written a book together with Sergei Guriev, a Russian economist. They wrote a book about information autocracy, which also describing Russia's regime. But now they're thinking about dictatorship of fear, where Russia now is moving. But let's look at the numbers. In 2012, the higher education in Russia was 76%. And in 2019, it was 86%. So Russian society is quite educated. Of course, we can discuss the quality about this education, but that's another question. At the same time, the control of internet, although we know that FSB is now rather active, and it's very, very difficult to be, as you said, how we can have education in terms of controlling organs which are a repressive apparat. But still, we know that despite this control, still the numbers for those who use internet has been growing since 2012 from 40% to 74%. So we see this kind of protest inside the Russian society, which we should see. So again, going back to your question, Václav Havel said 10 years ago that the transformation of communist regime will be worse in Russia. You know, we're going back to the experience we have had in other countries, and I believe Russia will be democracy. And it's not only about hope; it's also about the ways the militarization in Russia still failed. It is failed. We don't see people crowding and wanting to go to the war. And of course, this control of education and control of young people is also a substitute for ideology was also absent. There is an absence, and of course, it's very, very difficult, I think, to work with inside the educational system inside Russia. But I think, again, my last point, which is I want to just underline, learning, teaching someone is the best to behave yourself as you want your students want to be. So when I was a student here at University in Oslo studying political science, by my time then, there was a qualitative reform in Norway, which actually made the scientists more applicable to the gas and oil industry. That means that humaniora and human rights courses were actually removed. And this is also very bad in terms of democracy, as you mentioned. Because when you think about democracy, understanding here in Norway, it's a bit as if everyone needs to understand your rights. But what is your responsibilities then? What is your what about your impact to keeping this state as democracy? This is also about bureaucracy in democratic countries, which need to be oiled all the time by civil society groups and by the groups in community who can keep on telling them what to do. And that also comes the community of our, I don't know, if not Smarodina. Yes, I cannot say it about. Yeah. So my point is that our task then now to give real picture of what is going on, that there is no majority, 95% of Russians who support this war. And we should keep on criticizing those journalists, those media who keep on always underlying the popularity of Putin. There is no popularity of Putin. There is no majority for the war. There is a really very complex picture, and stop always depicting him as if it's simple. It is not. And you have to have your responsibility to understand it.
Thank you. Thank you, Ina. And I think this goes also to the role, again, of the civil society communities in exile, of the diaspora, talking about the awareness raising. Eugenia?
Да, ну, по-русски опять, окей? Ну,
Yes, keep forgetting names. I will agree with Selma. Everything about support to students, to young people in long-term perspective, it's very important, truly. We have experienced that, as Ina said, coming from politically raped regions in Russia. When you come out of there and you come to a democratic country, and even if you're young and you're 17 years old, you're perceived seriously. You can express your opinions about politics, about the world, and you're perceived seriously. Of course, it works, and people can change for democracy. You don't need major education for that. You just experienced it. So in this sense, I'm not really worried for Russians who are in Russian Federation, because if you create for them some conditions, just allowing them to speak, not something complicated, just for them to be able to speak with open doors in the classroom or school or university, like it was until 2015, 2016, because after that people shut the doors. I did that. It's unfortunate, but it was a survival mechanism, and we called our workshops on human rights, we called them different names, like intercultural dialogue and so on. We were keeping them hidden. Now we have to rethink it. When we work in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, I see there a trend to have euphemisms, calling it cultural dialogue, but we speak about tortures or safety on the streets, and what police does and so on. So this moment is very touchy. And we must not forget about that, be it Russia or some other object. Coming back to Russia and to the role of so-called diaspora or communities, I agree that people are so many and they are so different. And if we speak about Russian reality, yes, there are more than 100 different ethnicities with their own language and culture. Even if it had been oppressed by years, they still keep their narratives. They survive. And it's fortunate that they survive when they are transferred orally. When you come to Tambul in Russia and you are there in university, you hear wonderful speeches, etc. and so on. Foreign experts are speaking. But then in the evening, they take you to the monument of Tambov men, where they have their narrative about this monument, about an uprising, and they speak about it at home, and it will go outside when the tragedy in Ukraine ends, because people are still there. Andrei Danilov, who sits here in the room, he has his own narrative, his own story, being an activist who fights for Sami minority. So we are all here, we are all different. We try to keep connections with people who stay in Russian Federation, who try to survive somehow, who use the language of parables, who speak in between the lines. But there will come a time when those between the lines will fall apart and we will call things their true names again. But it's important that we, being here in still, I would say, safe reality, it's important for us to call the things by their true names. We have to, again, come to different contexts and show these pictures. This is jail in Russia today. This is a country that used to be the member of the Council of Europe and who is in the UN Security Council or any other structure. And this is the country which now imprisons people in such conditions. And this also has to be discussed, and who, if not us? I think that Russians who are abroad, they have legitimacy to speak that. It's one thing when an expert having gone to Russia then tells people about it. Another thing is when people understand, have gone through it, when their relatives are under such conditions, or they are already there, and so they can discuss it. It's not structured education, but it's indirect education, informal. And now about the latest situation during the war in Ukraine. Of course, information plays a major role, and people who are abroad have made enormous efforts, have spent enormous time and energy going back to depression and back to talk with their relatives and colleagues who stayed there, to give them some information that is different from the official narrative in Russia. And it's very, very important. As Nastya said, it will once end. And the earlier we start to hit this wall, to crush it, and give them arguments against the propaganda, the earlier we start giving Russians those counter arguments, the better it will be for everyone, both for Russia itself and for Norway, its neighboring country. No matter in what condition Russia will be afterwards.
I will allow myself to take a few minutes from the lunch that will be after to ask if there are questions from the audience at this point. We have there from Ivan, I see. To add, okay, yes. And then from Lisa, fantastic, okay. Mm-hmm.
Вот Иван, кстати, диаспора из Испании.
By the way, Ivan is diaspora from Spain. Thank you for introduction. I will speak in Russian. Because if we do not speak Russian, we will probably at some point stop being the representatives of that country we were exiled from. I would like to thank Norway and Norwegian society and government for the open border. Thank you so very much for being the only country now in Europe who still allows Russians to come. How you can't imagine how important that is. I know that now from some communications here from the panelists and members of discussion that Norway believes that 95% of people support Putin and war. For me, it's a shock to find out about that. As it is a shock for Norwegians to think that. No one knows really how many people support Putin and how many people support war. Very, very careful estimates by the scientists say that it's 5 million in absolute values. 1 million left since February 24 from Russian Federation left to abroad. About the rest, we do not know what their opinion would be if they had access to democratic education, if they had access to understanding what are human rights, if they were able to talk with each other and have dialogue. In my own personal experience, I saw people coming here with propaganda in their head. If there is someone who meets them here, which is important, and holds their hand, they change their opinion. They start understanding what is a democratic country and why people have to have human rights, the rights that the Russian Federation takes away from them, though they should not be taken away, and according to the declaration of UN. And so those people come back to Russia and they become different, like different small flames of this knowledge and of our hope. So once again, thank you so much, Norway. Don't think that Russians are zombies. We are just like you. Thank you.
Comment, yes.
Hello, I'm Lisa Wolfson. I'm from Germany now, originally from St. Petersburg, but I live in Germany for some time, for quite a long period. And as Evgenia said, I'm from Demokratia initiative, and the name of our initiative, it's a pun, because ja in German it's yes, and in Russian ja means me. So we want to say yes to democracy, and also that democracy starts with ourselves. It always starts with me, with us. And we also sometimes we use the term diaspora, but more often we speak about community and community building. So it's really difficult to find a proper term now, because, for example, we understand us, we see us as part of a civil society in Germany and in Russia. So it's somehow hybrid state. So it's quite difficult to divide, because some of us live quite long in Europe, in Germany, and some just came to Germany, and some of us who live for a long time in Germany are very connected to Russia. So I think that today we need perhaps to look for new concepts. And another point I wanted to add for us, for our initiative, the first topic now is, of course, the war in Ukraine, and we made quite big demonstrations in Berlin, and we are always thinking about projects or those very, very small things and petitions and different things to show that we are against this war, and to help refugees, and to just to do something against this war. And another topic, the second topic is it's to support people in Russia, and I wanted also to thank Ina for her holistic view, of course, that she said that there are very, very different ethnicities in Russia, and people in Europe, they don't know it. For them, it's a homogeneous space, but it isn't, and we would like we try to tell European countries that it's more complicated, and we hope that you have interest in our communities, and that your journalists also write about our communities, our diaspora communities, and tell this different story. So it was it was longer than I wanted, but that was, I think, important. And yes, yesterday the State Duma, they proposed to declare some diaspora organizations, and also our initiative, Demokratia, they proposed to declare us as undesirable or even extremist. We don't know yet, but yes, it's like this, but it's okay, I think.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question. Yes. Let's take one more question, then I ask the panel if there's any comments to what was heard, short comebacks, and then we break for lunch. Please, Natalia.
Dear all, thank you so much. My name is Natalia Yeremeyeva, also from the European Wergeland Centre, and that was an extremely interesting discussion. We all know that the concept of diaspora is very complicated, especially when it comes to the Russian diaspora. And my question probably would be a bit provocative, because we hear the numbers, right? 95% who support or do not support Putin. Well, what I read is like 70%, but it's not so much about that, but more about those Russians who find themselves in the European societies, Norwegian society, or any other European countries, who've been here forever, since they were young. And they're also part of diaspora, but not necessarily support the movements we discuss here. And for those of us who read different publics, and we see this plenty of discussions that those people were not really influenced by the democratic values, even though they received education here in these European countries, but still support Russian regime or Putin's regime and still express the points of views which are not really representative of these educational systems they have been a part of. So my question is, how would you comment on that, and what has to be changed, or what other factors can influence this particular part of diaspora, which can make them go a bit away from what Russia today transmits to us in the news and become kind of more a part of this democratic movement after 15, 20, 25 years of living in the European societies, but still being the agents of the current Putin's regime. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Natalia. Who would like to give a... Yes, please.
Well, yes, thank you, Natalia. It's not that provocative. I mean, that's reality we're facing, I have to admit. But I would not put it as a typical Russian diaspora case. I mean, my colleague here back in the Human Rights Academy having origin from Eritrea, probably facing the same. You have divided groups supporting regime, not supporting regime. Going back to Russia, Russian-speaking community here in Norway, I mean, we are quite a lot of people. We are thousands of people living here. Of course, it's again not possible to compare with the German case when you have 1.2 million people, Russian-speaking people. It's crazy. So you have a great job to do there when it comes to information delivery and all this stuff. Our case is a bit easier in a way, but still we face that, of course, sometimes it's difficult to reach people who grew up in this society, but somehow longing back to this imagined homeland, which was presented by a researcher earlier. So maybe it takes time again. Maybe it's the way to go to try to counterbalance, try to reflect what this homeland is about, basically. What are you longing for? Can you just face the reality? Can you just face the facts? Can you just compare their different sources of information like Guardian, Interfax, and the Norwegian newspaper Aftenposten, and we have a talk about it? That's probably the way to go. I don't know, but I would absolutely agree. It's many different personal stories. Some are still afraid, even though they have been living here for ages, to go out basically and to show their faces. Mm-hmm. We saw it when back to the beginning of the war on 24th of February. Smorodina has delivered a letter addressed to the ambassador, our ambassador of Russian Federation, because many of us are still Russian citizens, in addition or without Norwegian citizenship. So we are voting. We are going to this embassy to participate in elections, right? We are expecting that our voice are being counted with. When war is being studied, aggression is being studied, of course, the first reaction is to produce a letter, kind of appeal to ambassador. Hey, look, guy, we don't want you to represent us anymore. You'd better go back. You'd better come out of your office and say a word. Don't be afraid. Something like this. But then again, you have people who can hardly put their signature, put their name on this letter. But that's the reality. On the other hand, it's something new. This mobilization of the so-called diaspora, it's a new phenomena, I would say, because I've been living here for 25 years. I cannot remember this standing outside the Russian embassy protesting against the war in Chechnya, for example, or commemorating their killing of Anna Politkovskaya, right? But 15 years ago. I mean, it was a minority. We were 3-4 people there. You remember this very well. Now I see more and more people are coming out. So maybe at the beginning, let's hope. But we try to reach as far as possible into Russians, into Norwegian society as well.
Thank you, Eugenia. I know we have a comment from Ireland.
Yeah, just on the concept of the diaspora, it's not so complex and complicated. I think like this, it's perfectly fine that there are lines of division within the diaspora. It's not a homogeneous unit. And there are always these kind of fractions and conflicts within any community, right? What we often see in diasporas are conflicts along generational lines, for instance, between the first and second generation. We didn't talk much about that. Or gendered conflict lines. So I think there are two questions in a sense, like what's analytically correct? And I think diaspora sounds to me like it's analytically fitting. And then there's a question of like what works in practice and pragmatically out there in the field, which is kind of separate. I just wanted to point that out. Thank you
very much. Ina, short, and maybe that's the last.
Very, very short. Don't sleep. Be awake.
Thank you. We have one short comment.
Yes, 30 seconds. По-русски, если можно.
A colleague from Germany said that their organizations can be recognized as undesired or extremist organization, and it's okay, and everybody laughed. No, it's not okay, because cooperation with undesirable organization in Russia is crime, and cooperation with extremist organization the same. And it has very major consequences. So, if a person who even is in Norway or in Germany or in Austria or anywhere else cooperates with such an organization and then, for example, goes to Russia to bury a relative, they can spend the end of their life in prison, so it's not okay. Dear friends, you probably don't really understand the number of tools the regime has in order to persecute its citizens wherever they are. Thank you.
It is indeed important, especially also in view of what was presented in the very beginning, and it is important to be aware about these issues. I know there might be more discussions, but we really have to close. We are over time. I would like to thank our fantastic panelists. Thank you so much for being here with us, and thank you to all for participating.